Hey, Greg.
Hello,
Good morning.
it's Friday. How are you?
It's Friday. I'm good. I know we both teach at UConn, but I'm in stores. And the last 2 days, we've had the sound of helicopters in our little rural town here because of the visit of our sitting president, Joe Biden.
Our beloved president.
Beloved. Indeed. Or at least the relief president after what we've had. But yeah, it's funny because it's a bit of a ribbon cutting event, for the Human Rights Center. And I don't think we're going to talk so much about human rights today, but like I think, you know, there's so much of this ceremony around around these things, around this work of development, humanitarianism, and so on and so forth. So, but I think we'll focus on aid, charity, humanitarianism, and things like that today. And I think before we get our guests in, I guess I wanted to ask you, tell you to develop a little bit more of what you were telling me as we were conceiving of this, which was your experience when you went to Haiti and also Haiti in general, and humanitarianism and the problems of humanitarianism when it comes to Haiti. I don't know. Next week we're going to get into it big time with Marlene Daut and Zaka Toto, but maybe you can say a little more.
Well, it's an anecdote more than an experience in this way, right? But I went there a few years ago for a scholarly university conference. And it was an interesting experience. I'd never been to Haiti before. And the flight from the US was, I want to say visually jarring, right? Like half the people on the plane were missionaries or, members of different NGOs, many of them religious. And you could tell from the way they were dressed, which was something. I ended up sitting next to one, which was a delight. Right before we landed, a person who was dressed sort of like a nun, but not a nun. I don't know what denomination they were. They were wearing those, ankle length dresses and anyway, I never asked. But maybe 10 minutes before landing, she turned to me and said, "Oh, have you ever been to Haiti?" And no, I've never been. And she said, "Oh, you will see misery like you've never have before." It was. Yeah, I was like, "Oh, you've never seen this level of poverty or something along those lines." I was just, it was just, there was such self-satisfaction in describing what she was doing there, and she worked in a hospital or something. I mean, I'm sure, I think part of what she did was interesting, but the discourse was really what like left me speechless. Right, it was really like somewhat of a the emphasis, right? And it's just not like she asked me what I'd seen in my life. It was just assumed, right?
Yeah.
It'll be unbelievable. Anyway, so that was my my anecdote.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wrote about the ways in which humanitarian organizations deploy digital tools and kind of exacerbate representations of like brown and black children, poverty, and so on and so forth. And for a while, and I don't know right now, I'm not in touch with it, but there was a whole kind of thing around digital humanitarians, and it was actually coming out of the type of aid and efforts that were mobilized with the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. But then also the last 2 years I've spent in Kenya, which is like in Nairobi is the polis of like humanitarian and NGO workers. And you know what? They live in style. And there is a whole kind of, they have immense power. And they're almost always European, and of course American too, but European at the end of the day. So there is some colonial links, and hopefully our guests can develop it more. But it's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, it was the same, and we ran into them in different places. And I mean, again, I'm speaking about this mostly visually because it was really shocking. wearing the bright colored shirt. It looked like holiday camps, and it was just a weird mix of things just in the way they behaved and looked. That was really really disturbing. But, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have sworn that this season we are going to try to keep this stuff within into not talk for longer than an hour. So let's bring our guests in. But before that, let's see them doing their thing first here.
For salvation, running out the door of the old gas station. He makes it to the pump and say, "Don't ask no question. Quick, get into the car. We're heading for redemption."
Okay, here they are.
Hello.
Monique Kwachou and Jehan Bseiso are here in the studio with us. Please unmute yourselves so we can dive right in. But I know we showed these wonderful, brilliant intellectual women and them in some action shots. But Greg, do you want to also read out Monique's bio, and then I will do the same for Jehan?
Yes. Monique Kwachou is a Cameroonian writer, youth worker, and postdoctoral researcher of gender and for development. Monique meanders between the roles of creative, academic, and development practitioner, yet all of her work, research, and practice generally centers the theory and application of African feminist thought, education for addressing social injustice, and attaining sustainable development. In 2013, she founded Better Breed Cameroon, through which she and colleagues have since run quarterly youth development projects, ranging from national writing contests to book drives, career days, and more. She has served as a part-time lecturer with the University of Buéa's Department of Women and Gender Studies, on and off since November 2015. Her work, poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction, has been published on platforms such as Africa is a Country, This is Africa, and in African literary anthologies like the 2011 Kane Prize for African Writing Anthology and FemWrite Uganda's collection of African women's writing in the same year.
Okay, fabulous. I'm gonna read a slightly shorter one of Jehan just because I've known her for so long. I felt odd writing long streams of things. Jehan Bseiso is a poet, researcher, aid worker. Her poetry, which is just absolutely beautiful and very impacting, has been published on several online platforms, including Warscapes, which is administering this live stream. She has a co-authored book called Remember My Name, and it was the Palestine Book Awards winner in the creative category a few years ago. She's also the co-editor of Making Mirrors, Writing/Writing, okay, which is a pun, writing/writing by and for refugees. She is on the board and helps organize the Palestine Festival of Literature, which is a traveling festival, which is just absolutely incredible. And that's where I ended up meeting her. So I'm very excited to welcome her. She leads a kind of double life. She's on the one hand at Doctors Without Borders as a communications director, and then by night, she is this kind of resistant poet and activist through her poetry. So it's it's very interesting. All right, so let's jump into our first question. What we plan to ask them, Greg, and I'm going to just say it, which is that both Jehan and Monique work in very different places, but they do work with, around, alongside humanitarianism and circuits of humanitarian aid. So we wanted to have our viewers hear a little bit about their personal journey and how they ended up interacting with this milieu. And let me start with Monique.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bhakti, for the introduction and time for being here. I would say I was interested in development work as I fell in love with youth development work while I was an intern, an undergraduate student. The idea was, okay, knowing our country, I knew that underemployment, unemployment is a major issue. And I've always wanted to be independent as soon as possible. So my ambition was to have a lot on my CV by the time I was graduating, so I could be considered for a job, because they always ask you how many years work experience do you have when you're straight out of school. So I was like, okay, I'm going to trick them by volunteering while in school. So I pretty much did like 3 days, 6 hours a day, 4 hours a day sometimes, at different CSOs while a student, while an undergrad. And I was just trying to fill up my CV. So by the time I was graduating, you couldn't tell me I don't have work experience. Um, but while I was there, oh, because I did, I volunteered a lot more than other students. I got exposure to development issues and development work early, or
Mm-hmm.
earlier than the others. And I think it's during that point that I recognize that most of the projects are dependent on who is giving the funding.
Mm-hmm.
If the international community doesn't want to fund this particular thing, it's not going to run, even if it's what is needed. So if this is what is needed, if this is what is being funded, that's what the CSOs are going to submit proposals for. So no matter what I suggested as a student, they were like, yeah, no, this doesn't work. And I was trying to explain to them, well, it will be helpful long term if you do this project. But
Right.
they're like, nobody's going to fund this.
Wow. So
So
money talks.
yeah,
Money
by the
talks.
time that's how I got there. So by
Mm-hmm.
the time I was graduating, I wanted to work in development.
Right. And I think Jahan, I don't know what her story.
I kind of started, so I graduated in literature and French philosophy, and kind of grew up in a region where a lot of humanitarian aid work was happening, was visible, was being done to us, mostly as recipients. And I always thought it was something other people do. And anyways, I'm a writer, so it was actually completely by chance. A small research ended up in my lap, and it was about perception of aid workers and humanitarian NGOs. And unlike many people who love to start their MSF or Doctors Without Borders journey by saying, all my life I've been wanting to work with MSF. It's what I've wanted to do since I was a child. I had no clue about this organization. It was not even in my peripheral vision. I have no unlived dreams. But touching a bit with what Monique just mentioned, one of the main things that attracted me is the independence of funding. And money talks. We'll get into that later. I suddenly started to want to get into the space instead of having things being done to us, programs carried out and rolled out in our context. People coming in to analyze countries that they visit 2-3 days later and suddenly become experts in. I wanted to try to be part of that story.
Right. And I know, Greg, you have a follow up, but I think I didn't say this in Jahan's bio, but she is Palestinian and she grew up in Jordan. And I have had the pleasure to visit her home, where they have the key of the house from which your family was, evicted, or I don't know, snatched out. Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
Monique, you mentioned CSOs. Could you spell that out for us?
Civil society organizations.
Okay, because I know you mentioned in your bio on your website how early on you get to meet with the non-governmental organizations and maybe talk about projects that they weren't necessarily interested in, as you were saying, were maybe what was needed, but not what they were going to fund. And so this makes me wonder if you could maybe tell us more about whether you do see a difference between humanitarianism and development, and what that difference is.
Okay, I think that therein lies the difference between what I was suggesting. So I was suggesting development projects and not humanitarian projects. At that time, we didn't really have humanitarian projects going on because it came with the crisis. I I would say the difference between development work and humanitarian work is how long term it is. One responds to a problem, and the other one is trying to avoid a problem coming to existence. So it's basically like, for instance, one of the projects I had proposed while volunteering, we are working with young girls in an at-risk community. And one of the projects I suggested, well, this is during one of my volunteer experiences, and these girls are in Tole, a small tea plantation village. And during that time, I suggested that they could have something like a take your child to work day or take a child to work day, because their parents work in the markets. They don't have anybody to look up to. Their parents work on the plantations. But if we pair them up with some other people, they can have mentors to guide them, to prevent the cycle or to stop the cycle, so to speak. That's what I suggested. And they were like, no, that's a nice idea, but it's not really something that will be funded. That's a youth development project. You're trying to see how you can break a cycle long term or change the way people think, that kind of thing. A humanitarian project typically responds to something that has come up, pretty much like a disaster or a war or chaos.
Can I? Why wouldn't they be interested in development? I mean, maybe it's a silly question, but just
Jehan was trying to explain this to me as well. Jehan, do you want to?
So the way that I understand it, and I think Monique as well, like described it perfectly, which is one is trying to prevent a problem from happening in the first place, and another is responding to a problem. However, to be very honest, the definition between development and humanitarian has gotten so elastic, and the lines completely blurred. A colleague and a friend of mine says that the example is like if a person is drowning at sea, development would be the missed opportunity to teach them how to swim, versus you don't talk about teaching them how to swim if they're drowning, if the house is on fire, if they're in the middle of the sea, you just pull them out. And humanitarian aid, that's what it does in the purest sense. It pulls people out. But then when humanitarian aid organizations are working in contexts like Congo, like others for 25 plus years, the line between we're here to do humanitarian and we actually need to be part of structural solutions starts to be really, really blurred. And it makes people very uncomfortable. So it's very elastic right now. Also, and then correct me if I'm wrong, Monique, or how you experience, how you see it, or Greg and Bhakti. There's also those organizations working in humanitarian aid also tend to want to have fewer structural stakeholders, government interlocutors, a lot of bureaucracy. I'm speaking here, for example, in the MENA region. If you're working in development, the stakeholders you need to have from the very beginning onboarded into your project idea, the way that you measure its impact, all of it tends to take time, and the returns on investment take time. Whereas humanitarian aid is a quick feel good thing in the bad sense. I mean, it's not because I think it should and could be more than that.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. And I feel like in these fields, there's always these metaphors like the drowning, save them or teach them to swim. But yeah, that makes that I understand actually better when you explain it like that. I think humanitarian, one of the things I experience as someone who is attempting to critique it through a post-colonial or a decolonial perspective is that it's very difficult to deploy any criticism. What's not to like about helping people? What's wrong with you? Why are you such a grouch? Why are you so mean? But many of those who look at it more closely are super critical of its core foundations. And both of you have worked in the field, so whoever wants to go first, go for it. But what are some of the core criticisms of humanitarianism as it operates today, its iteration today?
Of humanitarianism?
Yeah, just what are the things in your experience are some of the biggest issues?
I would say, honestly, my biggest issue with humanitarianism is how short-term it is and how short-sighted it is. It's like Jean's example, the metaphor she said. So when you pull the person out of the ocean, where do you keep them? There was a reason they fell in the ocean in the first place. So what prevents them from falling back into it? So if you saved me from migrating from the African continent to Turkey, if you saved me from the Mediterranean, as we have a crisis right now regarding that, but you keep me in a refugee camp, and it's still better than what I have experienced in my home country, then you'll keep saving people. But what's going to stop more people from falling in that ocean, from taking that route? So I think the short-sightedness is my problem with it. And obviously the patronizing way in which it's done.
What do you mean?
I would say the assumption that you know better than the person that risks their life, or the judgmental way we go about doing it, helping them. I remember being shocked at how they choose what you can eat with a meal ticket. And then the example being given was, we don't want them to eat unhealthy things, so junk food. And I'm thinking, well, the average human being will be looking for junk food to console themselves if they're going through a lot of difficulties. So nobody would stop you. Why do you think you need to police somebody else's eating? Because you're feeding them, because you're the one sponsoring it. So the patronizing way we go about humanitarianism is another issue.
Wow.
I completely agree, and I think so. The title of the session is what is it?
Who's afraid?
Who's afraid? We should all be afraid of humanitarian aid if it goes unchecked, if it goes unmonitored, and to those that are, we should all be very, very, very afraid if it continues to see people as recipients of aid, as passive objects of study instead of supporters, collaborators, and a little feedback box in the hospital is not an inclusive way of including people in your approach. And having a health promotion community engagement strategy, it may tick some boxes, but is also not a way, if it's not really truly grounded in the operational design, it's not a way of making communities included. So I definitely think we should all be afraid of humanitarian aid if it runs amok. And to the people to the people saying that you're kind of like the Grinch, Bhakti, with these comments, honestly, humanitarian aid can solve this problem by being the first to critique itself, and we're seeing more lately. So we need to be the ones looking at ourselves, and I say we, but I also say they, okay, a lot. so I'm not putting myself in the basket, but after 13 years with Doctors Without Borders, yeah, I think I'm a bit in the basket. So we need to be the ones leading the criticism and looking at the sore spots and what needs to change. And this attitude, this paternalistic approach that Monique was describing, needs to go for sure.
Yeah, I think we're all they, I would say.
I like that. True.
We are all we/they, because even if I'm not actually in the field, I'm always at the end of the day giving money, doing something. There's always some investment that the general public is forced into, no matter what. Sorry, Greg, did you want to ask follow?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about what Monique was saying about the patronizing attitude, and also in the light of your earlier comments about how humanitarian aid being short-sighted is also what you do in reaction to certain things, and maybe with less connections with local authorities and whatnot. I mean, that there seems to be more leeway. And I have to say, I realized depending on the place and situations, the way they behave might be very different. But it's hard not to see, and what behavior I've noticed and comments from certain NGOs, how their actions at least somewhat overlaps, colonial networks, right? And that attitude to me smacks of that. And I don't know that it's fair to all of them or even to few of them, but I'm just curious in your experience, how if that has played out at all, like how you see that potential connection.
how I sorry, could you repeat that?
So I said there seems to be an overlap between NGOs' behavior and own networks of action and colonial networks. From again from that are supposed to have disappeared. I mean, of course we know better, but I wonder to what extent that behavior is sort of an extension of
Yeah, like there's the civilizing mission, those kind of ideologies, having to saviorism. Saving is nice, but what's embedded in that saving, right? So
The
yeah,
idea that you do not need saving yourself, the idea that the other person is less than you,
yeah.
those patronizing concepts. Okay, I understand. Um, I would say this is not limited to humanitarianism, though. Even development work is involved.
Hmm.
And I, like Jehan mentioned, we should be criticizing everything.
Hmm.
There's a saying that don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And I think, well, you have to look a gift horse in the mouth, or else you'll not be able to take care of your gift. And you won't be able to appreciate your gift properly.
Hmm.
So, considering the fact that we have, that's very, very, very sad. The idiom, by the way, considering the fact that we have in history the Trojan horse. Whenever I hear that, I'm like, yeah, we should have looked at that in the mouth before letting the Trojan horse in. But so I would definitely say there is an overlap, and that overlap is intentional.
Hmm.
We, for instance, have multilateral organizations, international organizations that are not multilateral, private foundations, local community-based organizations, civil society organizations. There's so many.
Hmm.
There's so many that, and they go unchecked because we keep thinking as long as you're doing good, philanthropy is a good thing.
Right.
So we don't question. I don't. I wouldn't say the overlapping is what should be. I wouldn't say the overlapping is the problem so much as the fact that there is an overlapping, because I think it's intentional.
Mm. It's by
It's
design, you mean?
exactly. So if I know, for instance, I recall as a My Lead Fellow, this is a Moremi initiative for leaders, young women leaders in Africa. I was a fellow in 2015, and we go to Ghana, and part of it's an initiative to encourage young women's leadership, African young women's leadership. And while I was there, we took a field trip to the Boer Bank, and I asked them. They explained to us that they don't carry out projects themselves; they do reviews, and they give funds to local organizations to carry it. And they're so proud of this, and the fact that they're not doing it themselves, so it's somebody else doing it. So if
Hmm.
it goes awry, it's the local organizations that have made it go awry, not the multilateral organization.
Right.
And I remember asking, okay, that makes sense according to you, but you as a multilateral organization knows, for example, that Cameroon has money with France for years now, and you are giving us loans. Why would you be giving us loans when your member country is owing us? Why
Yeah.
not just give us back our money? Why would you be? So
Right.
it's intentional.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean the Franc-Afrique is a whole other dimension, but I guess I want to push and maybe John can take it too. I want to push more towards this colonial genealogy because we are thinking on these live streams, on these episodes, which are often for pedagogical use and so on, about things that where colonial structures are deeply embedded. And in the case of humanitarianism, you always also think about like the Red Cross, for example, emerges out of precisely that time period, and there is a push within academia, within generally within thinking, to think about decolonizing humanitarianism, decolonizing development, decolonizing human rights, and all those things are interlinked in various ways, but what they have in common are their colonial histories. I don't know, Jahan, you're working primarily in the Middle East. Does that play out? It's how does it factor?
It does play out, and it's, I think, Middle East and beyond. And it has, beyond like post-colonial theory, it has very concrete manifestations. It's the way you organize your HR organogram in what you call already the field, you know, which is already something. It's how you assign responsibility and power. It's how you define pay scale. And it's really in every single thing you do. And language right now, I think there's a reckoning among aid and development humanitarian and development organizations right now that a large part of it is public accountability, and a lot of it sometimes is driven by, again, this interrogation of what you mentioned, Bhakti, people going to do good things do bad things, they are accused of sexual assault, they redirect funds, they traffic, yes, and it's unconscionable and it's unimaginable, but it happens. And I think we need to remove this bisounours or like beautiful hearts from our eyes when we talk about this industry, because we need to look at it for what it is: gritty, real, ingrained in history, and in material reality. We're talking a lot in MSF right now about language, about the words that we use to describe different categories of staff, about pay scale, about equity, about inclusion, about why do we really refer to ourselves as an international organization if you look at senior positions, 50% of the workforce still comes from one continent and they're male. So what does this mean? And there is this process of reckoning, and it looks like it's a moment of now, and it looks like it's a fashionable mode, but it's actually the work of people who came before us for a very long time, who are very, very, very uncomfortable with what they see. Me, I'm just interested in popping this halo. And I think, as not coming from privilege, meaning, of course, I come from privilege because, I went to school. I was not in Palestine, displaced in Gaza, which is where my parents come from, etc. So we are all in different ways privileged. But it was really interesting for me to come into this industry from a place of not doing extra, or not out there to help the world, out there as a job with a clear focus, with a motive, with an intention. But it's a professional thing, it's something that I'm doing. It's not, I'm not God's gift to anything, and that needs to change. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's very powerful. And one of the things you were saying reminded me also of the pay inequality in NGOs, where the ground staff whose language skills are needed, whose links and networks and groups are constantly required to mobilize the project, are always paid less, whereas the expat packages for Europeans and Westerners in general are super fat. There's just a ton of money, cars, houses, all that. So yeah, I had forgotten in a way about that, but that's such a big thing. Sorry, I don't want to.
For the Anglophones out there, I just wanted to say that bisounours is Care Bear. I think it's important to make that clear. Weirdly, a very French expression.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, I guess part of it's not really a different topic, and it's not really a very articulate question, I guess. But I feel, I have a hard time seeing how NGOs can operate without, some I don't want to say compromise, but engagement with local authorities. And in many cases, those local authorities are also agents of, of violence against their own people, or at least part of their people. I mean, that is very much part of the difficulty of the work, however well meant or badly meant it is, right? I mean, you have to deal with those circumstances. But I guess Jehan, the mission you describe, and the sort of self-critique that needs to happen. I guess I'm trying to imagine how that might work, considering that other sort of, interactions with states, I guess, and government.
Practical kind of heart of it.
Yes.
Sometimes.
So there's a big part of that. So you're very right. And often I just have to put it right out there. I mean, I'm the experience that I have in the field is with an organization that is completely financially independent. It means that today in Lebanon, where I am right now, if we would like to redirect our current activities to include, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 different nationalities than what we had yesterday, we don't need to write 1,000,001 proposals and convince 1 or 2 states that we need to do that, which is more the reality Monique was describing. And a lot of civil society organizations are at the mercy of donor funding and donor trends. And then, you bring into it counterterrorism, and you bring into it this group is more relevant than this group, and this group is more strategic importance. And then it gets really, really muddy. So at least organizations, at least like MSF, have a duty to kind of keep pushing and advocating for the independence of funding. And where possible, because we don't have this relationship with donors, but our governments is a different issue, but with donors in a similar way, then around the table, we can push for things that CSOs, NGOs sometimes cannot. And that's, I feel, how MSF should use its power. And to be like, I hate voice of the voiceless. Don't get me started. That's another webinar. But to push, please. But to push, And then for states, for sure. And we're not talking about it here, but let's say in the Arab world right now, a lot of Saudi government is bombing Yemen. Saudi government has also started a humanitarian operation in Yemen, and those words are up for grabs for whoever wants to use them. Every government is now interested in doing development and humanitarian aid if they weren't before, and it's even harder to hold to account. So not an easy answer, but it's where possible to call for accountability and to push. It should be done, but states run the show in many places.
Yeah, Monique, you want to add to that? Specifically Cameroon, maybe.
I agree with Jehan that states run the show, which makes things even more hypocritical, because the states run the show based on whoever is leading the state. The international organizations write reports every year criticizing the state, calling this, showing how the state is failing its people, and yet gives the state money to continue failing its people. So I would definitely just say it's all there in each other's pockets. It's all very intentional, and it's all very it's layered. So I do not think in any way that we are meant to be saved. I actually came to, and I know this sounds sadistic or, well, cynical, but it's a recent experience that happened this year, based on one of the leading, actually the main political pressure group in our country, Stand Up for Cameroon, led by Kawala, a former presidential candidate. And she rallied a group of women, myself included, to write the IMF and demand that we should not be given more funds for COVID-19, because the first loan was embezzled. And we are been getting documents of the leaking of embezzlement and so on and so forth, and nobody's being held accountable. Nobody's, based on the loan agreement, our government is supposed to send in a report. That report has never been sent in. We petitioned the IMF not to give us any more loans, and the IMF still does. They actually dribble us. They cater to us in that we had meetings with them. They tried to say, oh, what problems do you have? And they tried to act like they cared. But ultimately, they didn't. They just want you to owe them more so they can they get back the money with interest. It's the way they make money. So you start to question if the government, the multilateral organizations, all of them, they're in on it. The only person, it's actually them against the citizens.
That's intense. Different but interconnected. And I wanted to get to some kind of talk around solutions and things like that. But before, just an interest of mine, I mean, something that you all have to probably interact with is celebrities, celebrity ambassadors, the whole "we are the world." I know that the discourse has moved a lot, since the Bob Geldof and like those Band-Aid concerts and things like that. Um, and it has new avatars, new iterations. But, you know, there is a real push all the time to create these ambassadors for humanitarian work and so on and so forth. I'm thinking about the example of Bollywood actress Priyanka Chopra, who is phenomenally popular, and has is completely patriotic and says some of the wrongest things, but she is part of some strange kind of ambassador work. And what do we do with this? And this is another thing that gets hard to criticize. If a celebrity can mobilize funding, why are you against that? If a celebrity can amplify a cause, why are people critiquing it? So what do we say in response to some of the problems these poses? Or maybe there's no problem, I don't know. Whoever wants to take it.
I think I will. Okay. So I would say, quite frankly, it's easy to silence those that do not have platforms.
Hmm.
And if the celebrities could give their platforms to those that are actually experiencing the problems to share their stories themselves, I would respect that. But once you silence the person that's actually living there, living in Cameroon, who face the repercussions of whatever campaign you're leading or whatever statement you're making, then you're not really helping the situation. You're just making yourself look good. So I would say, yes, there is a problem with celebrities taking over because it's easy for them. We are validating the fact that they have platforms that will spread the word, yes. But there are many different ways they could use those platforms without silencing other people. And also, we tend to put these celebrities on pedestals. We, as human beings that we are, suddenly, and I would say, for example, using an example of a writer, Chimamanda Adichie,
Hmm.
and this is somebody who I respect a lot, and I love her work. However, she was put on a pedestal as a feminist icon. Now she's just as human as everybody else. And she didn't study feminist studies, nor did she say at any point that she studied feminist theory or post-colonial theory and the rest. She's a writer, a fiction writer. But because she's good with words, because she has a large platform and used her platform to bring up feminist issues, she was made a feminist icon. Now, when she makes a mistake in the way she words a problem, or when she responds to a feminist issue, she is being dragged left, right, and center. And it's a clear example of why we shouldn't make celebrities or humanitarian icons, because there's a difference between somebody who has studied this problem and somebody that is just feeling the problem. It's not like she's done anything that I would expect a normal human person not to do. But because you have put her on a pedestal, you expect better from her.
Hmm.
And therein lies the problem.
Yeah, yeah.
If we don't put them on a pedestal, we won't have this risk of being cancelled or this risk of them saying speaking on what they might not have studied or they do not understand in full.
Yeah.
Or at least we'll be able to take it with a pinch of salt,
Hmm.
knowing that this is this person's opinion, not a feminist icon's opinion.
Hmm. Absolutely.
I think I completely agree with what Monique said. And I just want to say that I think it would be a bit too wishful thinking if we think we can disengage, not with the way that things are going, not with the way with capital, how capital flows go, and how consumers culture works. And how platforms and the digital world and all of this. So unplugging them, I think, is not an option. I think it's possible to like map areas of how problematic it is. So there are people, for example, who would say, I think they need to be framed, and I think humanitarian organizations who use them to fill ambassador quotas or to have fundraising galas, I think they should really approach it with caution and consideration in order to avoid the pitfalls that Monique was talking about. Because it's just when it's given too much space and getting out of scope that it can be problematic. Otherwise, it can just shed some light on issues, and that's the, let's say, the least harmful option. But the most harmful is exactly when people are speaking on behalf of others, okay, and speaking out of turn, out of context. And for me, I think there's a little bit of again, this like using the brand. It's a bit, suffering is not a handbag, So, yesterday, there's something makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Like yesterday, promoting this handbag. Today, you're raising awareness on this massacre. Tomorrow, this it's a Diet Coke. So how do we control that? I see that there's a question, so I'm going to leave it up to you, Bhakti.
Oh, it's okay. We could start. Yeah, we'll take the questions because suddenly we have a bunch, which will take me away from my question. But anyway, Usha is asking, what are your thoughts on how we hold together the absolute and urgent need to decolonize humanitarianism, decolonize humanitarian aid frameworks while also countering the ousting of organizations like Amnesty International by someone like Modi in India? So it's complicated. I don't know.
Do you want to take it, Monique, or me?
I can't speak for India, honestly.
Me neither.
But
Yeah.
I'll let Jehan speak for India. It's okay. At least you work within an organization like currently, so you might end up with such challenges. I mean, MSF has been kicked out of places. Lots of times it
No,
happens all the time.
absolutely. So for me, those two things, I'm not speaking to the India example specifically, but just in general, those two things are separate. Like those organizations, the Amnesty is one of them, Oxfam is one of them, MSF is one of them, need to decolonize, need to do a lot of work, need to do all those things. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a space to work. It doesn't mean that they should be killed or kidnapped. It doesn't mean that authoritarian governments should oust them. So I think I see that it's... I also like the question because it's like, how do we protect a space that is under examination right now? Because as I said, like, we should be afraid of humanitarian aid. They cannot take too much space. But at the same time, there's, with the way that the world is going and the needs just increasing across, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So we need still to protect the space to do that work. But how we do it, who does it, and how do questions of power, privilege, equity all play needs to be as part of the equation.
Yeah. And I think just to decolonize ideologically or monetarily some things is not to say stop doing it or to ban it or censor it and so on. So thanks for making that distinctions. Michael Bush has another question. Well, he has two. I'll try to put both. He writes, I think the guests have already touched on this on their discussion of development, but I wanted to hear them push on it a little bit more. Can you talk about how you understand the differences, overlaps, and paradoxes between humanitarian operations and human rights work specifically? And he continues with, also, can you talk about the interface between humanitarian organizations and private security companies in the field and what this might mean for the future of humanitarian operations? These are very, very large questions, whichever ones. Can start with this. I can put this other one back up.
okay. So I think I could take this one.
Okay.
Regarding the overlaps between humanitarian operations and human rights work, I would say, well, I think humanitarian work is pretty much founded on the human rights framework. We are doing humanitarian work because we believe what the human rights framework states, and we are trying to protect humanity, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say definitely there's a paradox between the two, being that what you consider my human rights was decided by you, the rights you think are more important and should be protected. Case in point, there is a right to education. And I, as an educationalist, will definitely say there's a right to education, and I stand for it. However, as my doctoral studies was on the whether higher education empowers Cameroonian women, I would actually add that it's not just about giving me an education, it's about giving me the right education. So if you're saying I have a right to education, but the kind of education you're giving me is the one that's going to further subject me or indoctrinate me to think you're better than I am, or leave me without the necessary skills to cope in my context because I'm learning everything about your context, then you're not being very helpful. Then your education that you're claiming I have a right to is not humanitarian.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we should also acknowledge something that Michael is saying, which is that overlap is so intense. And I'm speaking from a scholarly perspective. When I had an article which was looking a lot at Darfur and the mobilization around Darfur and Save Darfur and so on, and where the humanitarianism and the human rights, everything collapsed and was using each other's discourses. And again, the reviews that I received were like, no, you need to talk about them separately. No, you need to talk about them separately. And I kept trying to do that. And at some point I became frustrated and said, okay, but actually we need to see that they are imbricated, that they're totally enfolded and are utilized and expressed in various ways that become this particular monolith of an NGO industrial complex, or whatever Twitter type words we want to use. But Jehan, did you want to go with this second question, which was about
private security companies? Tricky question, and I'll touch on it a little bit. I think as indicators on conflict and increasing risks for aid, whether humanitarian or development organizations, as the risks increase, there is more and more this kind of polarized conversation between acceptance and access, and then like security. Okay, and the securitization of aid is a real issue. And there is this feeling that the higher the bunker wall, the more elaborate the security company, the safer you will be. And we have many examples with organizations using private security companies and not being safe. One, two, blurring the lines between them, and specifically, for example, in places like Afghanistan, between them and the army, between them and other more private entities. So at the same time, organizations, and here I would put the one I work in right now, like MSF, are a little bit more on what can be sometimes called as naive, like our principles and our mandate and our good reputation protects us. And if you look at the data, you would not really agree with this assertion. But having worked, for example, in a place like Afghanistan, and not only the private security companies and NGOs, but journalists. In Afghanistan, I've been around journalists who look like the army, who are wearing fatigues, who are an army who's walking around with big cameras. So this is another example, but I think specifically in complicated settings, this clarity, like this is an NGO worker, this is a private security company, this is a journalist, this is a member of the army. All of these categories need to be super clear, because the overlap can be a very dangerous one.
Yeah, wow, that's intense. Going back to something Greg had asked related to this, was about the governments. And when we're thinking about private security companies, it's often the solution for like the failed states, and I say that in air quotes, of course. What about that? Like, if that's the only alternative at the end of the day, journalists is a whole other conversation, and especially embedded ones. But what you described is like a warscapes, right? Like the field, the war zone field. But even if it's not a war zone, sometimes the private security stuff, you have no other choice if the government is kaput.
I'd like to think, I mean, again, for development and for humanitarian, I'd like to think that there's a choice. I think it becomes harder to see the choice moment. It can mean different things for how you decide to roll out. It can mean different decisions made for how you move with resources. It can mean taking things more into account rather than like in Nairobi, like the structures that you're describing, Bhakti, that stand out like a sore thumb. It can be in different ways, but also I don't want to imply that to get safety and security, you should also blend in your environment. In many places where we work, specifically if you are coming from outside, the request, particularly of some warring parties that MSF deals with, is we want to see you. Don't try to blend in. Please don't blend in, because you don't blend in. So we want to make it visible. You're coming here to do this work. You're not like merging with the community. So I think it's back to context understanding, and there's no one size fits all. Easy to say this for everything.
You're recommending Samantha Power go around in the same crazy SUVs that were causing trouble like some years ago?
Oh yeah.
You're advocating. I'm absolutely joking. Sorry, Greg, go ahead. I keep interrupting.
Well, I mean, I feel this goes back to what Monique was saying earlier, right? I mean, I was talking about neocolonial networks, but it feels like a lot of those networks are in a certain outlook and an attitude, right? Like this sort of savior, complex or, approach that is also, at least historically or genealogically, very, very colonial, right? And so I wonder, the webcast is about decolonizing. I wonder if you see a way to decolonize humanitarian aid or maybe other ways to improve it along those lines, because it feels like a lot of this also is people not taking into account the opinions and knowledge of the people that are purportedly there to help.
Mm-hmm. I mean, can I add to that the term, a very contradictory term for this conversation, which is about aid, but the question of defunding sometimes is that going to help? Like, if NGO work was a little less attractive, the expat packages were a little less fat, would that change something? Can we think about decolonizing, of course, but also defunding? I don't know. Is that a term that's applicable? I don't even know.
I definitely would say yes. If it was, the pay package was less enticing, I think we'll have a lot less selfish people in aid. We'll have a lot less abuses in aid. And I'm saying this being someone who, at one point, I'd applied for a scholarship, and my motivational statement said, I wanted to work for UNICEF because it felt like I was going to be doing a good human thing and getting paid very well. I said, very straightforward. Like, that's why I want to work for UNICEF. And it's the idea that all of us had, that if we study gender studies, which was hot cake on the development floor, we would be employed by organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Save the Children, and so on and so forth, and get paid well for doing things that make us look like the perfect Christians. So that's why a lot of us are actually going into it. However, if you're considering a solution for regarding decolonizing aid and making it more difficult for it to be abusive and exploitative, I would like us to note that decolonizing is not an end goal; it's a process that we are basically questioning. It's reiterative questioning. You're forever asking, why do I think this way? Is it because I've been socialized to think this way? Does this further my oppression in a particular way, or further put this person on a pedestal for being white or for being Western, so on and so forth? So if we understand that decolonizing is a process and ensure that the process is followed, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we ensure that there are standards, that there are questions that these organizations must respond to on a regular basis, we will reduce the way they go unchecked. I guess it's just to develop a system that will ensure that reiterative questioning and assessment of these multilateral organizations.
I completely agree, and I just want to add a couple of things. So defund for sure, even if it has a strong impact, this word. But also, I think we have to work on first interrupting the link between government and development, or sometimes the symbiotic, like two enmeshment. In many European ministries right now, their development portfolio is housed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's really like symbiotically super happy with foreign policy and sitting right next to it, very cozy. And we already know that that's a problem. And because that ends up dictating a lot of the agendas, what are the hot topics, what's not, and not based on needs. Okay. And then the other thing, I think, towards decolonizing aid from inside out, and an iterative process like Monique was describing, not an end goal. I think we really need to work on the literacy of people inside in the aid industry, and we are on their understanding of history, of colonialism, of context, and of their role, which I find is super lacking, because at least that has been my experience with MSF. And without that, we will not be able to do what we need to do, to be honest.
Yeah. Greg, were you adding something? I thought you started to speak.
No, I was nodding. See.
He's nodding. Okay, well, we are an hour in, and I think Greg is urging us to get to his favorite part, which is where he plays a few songs. And this is stressing me out today. What songs will you play that are related to this such a heavy topic? But before he goes, I want to just highlight a very quick thing, Monique, which is the intensity around gender discourses and gender rights and women as a consistent planetary kind of subject of humanitarianism and aid, like in the way in which they are constantly mobilized, used, utilized, etc. And I know you kept saying that, and we didn't develop it into a question, but I just wanted to just kind of put a little light on it. But okay, Greg is going to play some music, and okay, let's listen.
All right. Is that up? Okay. All right, we're gonna start with classics. I don't know that I need to introduce Fela Kuti, so I probably won't. I'll just say, generally speaking, godfather of Afrobeat, son of a feminist activist, teacher, union leader, became popular in the early 70s, touring with his band Africa 70. I'm playing this particular song, ITT, International Thief. It's not exactly about NGOs, but it's an attack on the Moshood Abiola, who was the head of the International Telephone and Telegraph and of Decca Records in Nigeria. So not about NGOs, but certainly about overlap between local authorities and international organizations.
Well, not true, I want to talk again. Not true, I want to talk again. If I lie, you could still punish me. If I punish me, you could do my punish me. You kill and they punish me. You could do my punish me. I read down for bookie you. I see some myself you. Welly, you.
Trying to find a 30-second excerpt in a 24-minute song is not the easiest thing I had to do, but I did it. All right. Next one, maybe the most fitting song for today, from Katibe Khamse, a Palestinian hip-hop crew out of the refugee camp of Borj al-Barajneh in Lebanon. They met there as teenagers in a school run by an NGO, as it happens, and recorded 3 albums in the late 2000s to early 2010s. Highly political lyrics exposing refugee life, attacking international intervention in Iraq, among other things. The band split up in the mid-2010s. Some of them currently doing music in France, for example. The song I'm playing is about corruptions among NGOs present in Lebanon. It's called Jamayat. I don't have any Arabic, so I apologize in advance. From their 2009 album.
جمعيات
هدول مصاري الوطن جمعيات اللي بحطوهم بشلون جمعيات عرصات هذا الزمان جمعيات لك عرصات جمعيات هدول مصاري الوطن جمعيات اللي بحطوهم بشلون جمعيات عرصات هذا الزمان جمعيات لكن الناس عم بتموت حتى المرة عندنا جمعيات الحرامية اخواني من ورا ظهري عم بيهربوا مصرياتي عم بنادي بالصمود سكين من ورا ظهري عم بيأمرني بالسكوت فرقش عن النجدة وسوداعات غربة.
I read this in translation, so I'll let people understand.
It's tough, huh? It's hard hitting. It's very good. I hadn't heard it before. It's excellent.
All right, and the last one, but not least, Bleak Bassi, a singer-songwriter from Cameroon, started playing music very early in his life, forming the band Makase in his 20s. After the band split up, he moved to Paris, started on a solo career, and in his own word, realized where it was coming from. So his music taps into a history and culture of Cameroon, and he sings in the Bassa language. He's also written children's books about ecology, and he was writing a novel about immigration, though I'm not sure if he finished it. This song, Where We Go, is from his fourth album, 1958, which is an album dedicated to Ruben Umniobe, a crucial figure of Cameroon's struggles for independence, who was forcibly erased from the historical record for close to 30 years. And so this album is from 2019, and this is Where We Go.
Gel Babylon Makos, where we decide to go.
I'm tempted to just let him play us off.
Oh my God, it's such a beautiful voice. Wow, it's pain. There's so much pain. Anyway, thank you so much, Greg. All right, anybody wants to say something, who wants a resounding last word? Jehan, Monique, something you want to tell us? No?
No resounding last word, but just to say thank you. I think this was, it made me think of a lot of different things, a lot of areas that I thought that I've reached certain or clear conclusions, and you've put everything into question again and made me think even harder and badder. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah. Monique,
Same here. I think I would just say thank you for having us. And I would like to say that these might seem like small things, but they aren't. This is actually the process of decolonizing, having the conversation over and over and over again, and criticizing over and over and over again. So we might not say we have decolonized any organization today, but we have brought it to the attention of some other people. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty much like, hopefully it has a domino effect.
Yeah.
So the more we talk about it. So thank you for having the space.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jehan, and thank you, Monique. We're going to get off, and thanks, Greg. Did you want to say anything? Good. All right. I'm going to call it over. Thank you very, very much. See you all next week. We will be doing Disrupting the Caribbean, and we will talk about the Caribbean, everything, the weather, the literature, the representation, everything. All right. See you all soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.